Welcome to the History Nerds and I podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Super psyched today. One of my favorite authors, Gary Krist. Hoping I could get him on the podcast. Finally, the stars aligned. His new book, Trespassers at the Golden Gate. Going to be one of the best books of 2025. Just guaranteed. I'm telling you, it's fantastic. It's about a true crime murder in Gilded-Age San Francisco, and Gary does what he does best. He just builds out this whole world. He explains San Francisco, what it was like, and how this true crime fit into it. The story is amazing. He's amazing. I loved it. I'm going to shut up so we can hear from Gary, because that's what you're here for. Let's do it. And here we are with author Gary Krist, Trespassers at the Golden Gate, a true account of love, murder, and madness in Gilded-Age San Francisco. Gary, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You can see it all over social media. I am a huge fan of you. And I just want to talk about this book is a little bit different for you. Your last three books have been focused on a city and then the stories around it, whereas this is almost reversed, where you're focusing on a very specific story, but also kind of telling the story of San Francisco. Was that intentional, or is that just how this book started?
It's really just how this book started. I really do always start with the city and then find the stories that will allow me to tell the story of the city. I try to tell the larger story through the personal narratives. And I've done it for Chicago, I've done it for New Orleans. And my last book, The Mirage Factory, was about LA. And so I thought, well, it makes sense to go to LA's perpetual California rival, San Francisco. My favorite part of this whole process is just when I start reading around. I read general histories of California and San Francisco. I read more specific biographies, kind of waiting for serendipity to strike. And sometimes it strikes several times. This time, there was a major strike when I came across this story, A.P. Crittenden and Laura D. Fair. I mean, on one level, it was just the classic true crime narrative about one of the most sensational murders in California history. In November of 1870, this young, beautiful, already quite notorious young woman fatally shoots her longtime adulterous lover on the ferry between Oakland and San Francisco, right in front of his wife and several of his children. So, I mean, the crime itself was about as brazen and scandalous as you could get. The victim was a very prominent local lawyer and California politician. So I knew that I would be able to get at a lot of San Francisco history through them. But there were a number of aspects about the trial that made it blow up into a nationwide sensation. And eventually it brought into its orbit really prominent national figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mark Twain, Horace Greeley. So I knew that I would be able to put it in a national context using this story. So it really had a lot of surface appeal, but it also had a lot of thematic appeal.
I should say, too, it's pretty obvious early on, because first of all, let's let everybody know, you know who's getting shot, you know who's doing the shooting from, page one. But what I did notice about this, too, is it seemed like you had a lot to pull from. A lot of historical true crime, authors very often have a lot of conjecture, a lot of figuring it out. It seemed like for this one, you had a lot to go off of, especially for their relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things that I always look for. It's one of my major criteria when I decide, is this story something I can work with? And it has to be extremely well documented. And in this case, this was really the richest source material I've ever had in any of my books. There were, first of all, it was such a national sensation that they commercially published the entire transcript, every word of this month-long trial. It was the court stenographers who published this. I have a feeling that would not be legal today, but they put it out. So I had all of that testimony. They also published a lot of the letters between A.P. Crittenden and Laura Fair, his mistress, which were admitted as evidence. And so they became public domain, and a lot of the newspapers published all of them, to the family's acute embarrassment, I should add, because there was a lot of embarrassing stuff there. But then also the Crittenden family, one of the daughters had collected all of the letters between AP and his wife, Clara, between AP and his children and the children among themselves. And these were all collected and discovered sometime, I think, in the 1980s in some warehouse in Brooklyn. Nobody really knows how they got there, but there was this cache of hundreds and hundreds of letters, all concerning these people, the Crittendens. And they eventually wound up at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, which is a very prominent history library. And they're very interested in the Civil War. And there's a lot of Civil War connection in these letters. So fortunately, they had all of them out there. But unfortunately, it was lockdown when I wanted to go do this research. So I had to basically wait for things to open up. And as soon as it was available, I went out there and just spent weeks in these letters. So I was able to determine what they were doing, what they were saying on almost a day-by-day basis. And it was really wonderful sometimes to have two letters, one from the court trial between AP and his mistress, and one from the collection between AP and his wife. And he's lying to both of them. There were times where I thought that I was catching him out 150 years later, but you can't get away with anything anymore. This really enabled me to depict these events on a ground level because, you can't make anything up. That's the new school of narrative nonfiction is basically you really want to footnote everything and make sure that no quotes are made up, no elaborate scenes are extrapolated. Some writers are a little bit looser with themselves than others. I like to maintain as high scholarly standards as I can.
Which, luckily, you had all this to go on. And let's talk about our main scoundrel, A.B. Crittenden. Where does he come from before he's set off to San Francisco? What's kind of his upbringing? And are there kind of any sort of omens about the type of person he's going to be?
I think so. He was born in 1816 in Kentucky to really Southern gentry. He came from a fairly prominent Kentucky political family. As a matter of fact, his uncle was John Jordan Crittenden, who was a longtime U.S. senator. He was attorney general under Tyler and Fillmore. And there was a time when he was actually talked about as a possible presidential candidate. AP, as they called him AP, it's Alexander Parker Crittenden. AP came from a somewhat less exalted part of the family, although his father was also a politician, but on the Kentucky state level. But his father had a weakness for financial speculation, and when he died, when AP was 16, he left the family with $30,000 to $40,000 debt, which was a huge amount of money in those days. And I think that this was really a formative event for AP. He was 16 years old, and he was suddenly the male of the family. And so he took responsibility for taking on this debt. And I think that ultimately shaped his character in that, first of all, he felt responsible for everybody's happiness. So that really came to play a role in his later life. But he also had this kind of arrogance or independent spirit. He was restless, and he didn't like anybody to tell him what to do. And I think that is really one of the keys to his character, because later on, when people were telling him things that he should not be doing in his love life, he just didn't want to hear it. He thought that he knew what he was doing and he wouldn't take orders from anybody. And I think that's one reason why he was not successful at West Point.
Let me cut you off there, Gary. Before you even get there, how embarrassed should I be? Now, we did go at different years. I went a few years after AP.
I would think so.
The scale of 1 to 10, how embarrassed should I be that we share an alma mater?
Well, my alma mater produced Aaron Burr, and he killed Hamilton.
Yeah, so, you win.
I don't think that our alma maters can really be held responsible for the flaws of their graduates, but they certainly were not proud of him. For one thing, he resigned his commission like weeks after graduation.
Yeah, you're not allowed to do that anymore. I can confirm that.
Oh, really? Oh,
No.
That's interesting.
I was standing in Iraq thinking, oh, yeah, I didn't have a choice.
And of course, his later career was nothing to be proud of. So I think they are probably prouder of you, Brendan, than AP Crittenden. So
you're making some huge leaps there, Gary, but I'll let it go. Then I think, right, he bounces around, and I mean, there's just so much he does, but he ends up in San Francisco. Now, I'm just going to say it, you're the master at this. making a city feel like a character. We know what San Francisco is now. When AP shows up in San Francisco, what's it like then?
Oh, it was like an incredible place. When you think about just before gold was discovered in the mountains to the east, San Francisco, which was called Yerba Buena then, was this kind of small Mexican town of 850 people. Within 2 years, it had grown to a city of 25,000. And a few more years, it would grow to 50,000. So it was totally chaotic. Once news of the gold discovery leaked out, people from all over the country, just like Crittenden, who was still trying to get out of that debt that his father had left him with. So he thought, I'll make a quick fortune in San Francisco. Well, it wasn't an original idea. People came from all over the world. So it was a chaotic place, and it was really one of the most diverse places in the world. There were people of all races, people of all nationalities, people of all religions, all classes, and they were all coming together with one goal, which is to get rich quick. So it really ended up being kind of an interesting social experiment because nobody was standing on any kind of ceremony, any kind of that Victorian stuff of this is the hierarchy and, I will not do business with a black person. No, in San Francisco, this was permitted. So it was an environment in which a lot of people who wouldn't get a chance in the hidebound cities of the East could really experience a good bit of financial and to a certain extent some social success too. I mean, people carried their prejudices with them when they came to San Francisco, but it was such an open and freewheeling society that, nobody was standing on any kind of ceremonies. So it was really, I would love to have, get into a time machine and find myself on the street in 1850 in San Francisco because there was really nothing else like it, I think.
Probably didn't smell great, though, is what I'm kind of assuming.
No. I mean, that's, when a city is growing that quickly, there are stories about there being like packing crates and food and all the stuff all over the streets. And of course, whiskey bottles were like 2 feet thick in certain places, and prices were ridiculous because,
some things never change, right, San Francisco?
They really, yeah. So it's been expensive, but it was even more expensive then because if you had a shovel and 3 people wanted your shovel, you could get $50 for that shovel. So it was really a wild time. And he at first said, there's no way I'm bringing my family into this. He said, I'll just make my money and go back. But eventually the city did settle down at quite fast pace. So eventually he did bring his family out to join him in San Francisco.
And another huge aspect of this is, you can get rich quick, but also you can either disappear or reinvent yourself. And that's such a huge part of even this story when we're talking about Laura, of, hey, you can leave a lot of things behind and you can become a whole new person and start over. And people, especially in the West at that time, kind of didn't ask questions because they were probably doing the same thing.
Right. I mean, the quintessential San Francisco story is this guy, Talbot Green, who came out a little before the gold rush. And he was very popular, very successful. And so in 1850, he decided, well, I'm going to run for mayor. And unfortunately, about a few weeks before the election, somebody found out that he was really this person named Paul Geddes, who had abandoned his wife and children in Philadelphia and embezzled his bank's money and had come west and totally reinvented himself. So he eventually did not become mayor, but that's the kind of thing that happened in San Francisco all the time. People came out and there was no connection with the East, so they didn't know if the stories you're telling about your family are true or not. So it was an easy place to reinvent yourself.
On top of that, this is probably the second most wild thing in this book. Before AP even gets to San Francisco, he's already a California politician, right? Like dude, tell me about this. He's a politician before he even gets there.
I know. Well, he made this 7-month overland journey from Texas, where he was living with his wife and family, And he shows up in Los Angeles and he meets a friend who tells him, California is going to become a state next year and we're already having elections. Wouldn't it be a good idea if you ran for assembly and, you would have this political office? And so when you go to San Francisco, you have a certain amount of gravitas, a certain amount of credibility. And such was the state of things in Los Angeles that this guy who showed up 2 weeks ago with a law degree managed to win a seat on the state assembly. And I think he got a grand total of 252 votes. That was all it took. So he was able to go to San Francisco as a state assemblyman, and that really helped him in his law practice, establish his law practice. And he also was responsible for putting in place a lot of the early law code of the state, some good laws and some not so good laws, because he was a true son of the South, and he was a believer in slavery, although he did not own any slaves himself.
Now, let's talk about our other huge person here, Laura. What's her background? How does she end up in California?
Well, she's about 21 years younger than AP. She is not from Southern gentry. She was born to a kind of hardscrabble family in Mississippi, Holly Springs, Mississippi, although she grew up in New Orleans. And coincidentally, her father died when she was 16 as well. But since she was a woman, the only way she could really ensure the prosperity of her family is like, well, I'm going to marry an older, successful man. That's exactly what she did. She tried it twice. Both of them turned out to be abusive alcoholics, so she divorced both of them, although one of them died before the divorce could go through. And all of this happened before her 20th birthday. And, to be divorced twice before your 20th birthday in the antebellum South was not a good thing. Women were supposed to stay with a marriage no matter how abusive it got, because that was what women did. So she really needed a second chance. And so in about 1856, so about 6-7 years after Crittenden went out there, she went out there with her mother and brother. But she had a harder time of it because the initial boom following the gold rush was in its bust cycle. And so she was having a hard time making a living. She tried again to marry an older, more successful man, but he proved to be a little bit of a ne'er-do-well. He had, like so many people, he had padded his resume, and he wasn't as rich or as successful as he made himself out to be. They got married, they had a daughter, but he eventually committed suicide, and so she was again left now with a young child and no visible means of support. So you can see why when she did meet A.P. Crittenden, she was attracted to him. Here's another older, somewhat respectable, successful man, and he told her that he was an unmarried widower when they first met. So this was sort of par for the course for her.
Well, it's also funny how I don't think this story, the way it happens, can happen anywhere else in the U.S. at this time because, and it's like, who's on first? AP would keep his wife and Laura separate, Clara and Laura separate, and would just kind of move to the other side of a mountain because there was a new town there. And then Clara, you stay there. Now I'm living with Laura. And he would just bounce back and forth, and people would talk, but people weren't really talking. And especially in the book, I'm sitting there saying, this can only happen here. You do this in Philly, people in New York are going to know. But out west, people were just a little bit quieter, and you could get that separation because you don't have the railroad yet. You don't really have the connection yet in the communications that something like the East Coast had, right?
Right. Yeah, this was during the Civil War, 1863. He had gone to Virginia City, Nevada, which is where the second great mineral strike of the West happened, the Comstock silver lode, which promised to be even more lucrative than the original gold rush. And that's where he and Laura met. But Clara and the children were still in San Francisco, which at that time was a 30-hour coach ride from Virginia City. So he thought, well, I have the best of both worlds. I have, my wife in San Francisco and I have my mistress in Virginia City. And he tried his best to keep them apart. They claimed not to know about each other, at least for the first 6 months. I think they actually knew more than they admitted to, but he wanted that. I think he said, I want to have my family life, but I also want to have this mistress on the side. I want everything. He was that arrogant.
Speaking of arrogant, I'd like to bring up the most insane thing. No, not shooting somebody in a group of people. AP sets it up. People are talking badly about Laura, his mistress, just to make sure it's clear to the listener, his mistress. He says, she's not my mistress. They're being very mean to her. Clara, do you know what would be nice? Clara, my wife, could we all have dinner together so that everyone can see that there's nothing going on? Gary, there's no way to say this professionally. What a dick. Like, right,
really?
Like the fine line between genius and insanity, he just kept jumping on either side of it, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, he claimed that this was the idea that he told Clara, well, my landlady's having these problems. He didn't mention an affair. He said, because of her marriages and people are talking, but if she were seen eating publicly with a respectable woman like you, it would really help her. So as a favor to me, would you do this? Meanwhile, to Laura, he's saying, people are talking about our affair, but if I bring you to have dinner with Clara in San Francisco, nobody will think that you are actually my mistress, because a guy would have to be crazy to bring his mistress and his wife together in front of 400 diners at the Occidental Hotel dining room. But that's what he did. And I don't think he really thought that people would believe it. I think he wanted to flaunt the fact that he had both this mistress and this family life at the same time. Again, his hubris.
Is this a situation, as a historian, as somebody who you said before, you want to make sure you get everything right? How many sources do you need to have for something that insane before you're like, holy hell, this actually happened the way people are saying? Because you have to read that the first time and be like, somebody wrote something down wrong. But this one, you're like, oh my God, what?
No, there were several sources for this. I mean, it was one of the few things that in their court testimony, Clara and Laura agreed upon. They did disagree on what happened after the dinner, but in terms of just bringing them together at the dinner in front of, all of the best of San Francisco society, they both agreed on that. So I do give credence to that. They both testified extensively in the trial, and for the most part, they were in agreement. There were certain key areas where they disagreed, and I kind of had to make a decision, whom do I believe? I think historians have to do that all the time, because it's very rare that you get a unanimous interpretation of an event. Usually there are different perspectives on it, and you have to say, well, who's actually closest to the truth? And, there's no way of guaranteeing that you make the right choice. But, I like to use as much direct dialogue from the historical record as I can, so that readers can make their own decision. Sometimes I'll talk about it in the endnotes. I'll talk about, well, I didn't really believe Clara here. I thought she was projecting this image as the dutiful Victorian wife, but I don't believe her here, or I don't believe Laura here in this part of her testimony.
Well, I think the book has so much in it, and we only have so much time. I would talk to you for hours about this if we could, but we talked a lot about Laura and AP, and we just don't have time for it. But Clara is no wilting violet either. Like, when you see some of the things that she says and the way she says them and when she says them, this is a formidable person herself who is playing just as many games as the other two are.
Yeah, she came from a very religious background and was deeply religious herself. She was concerned about AP because he claimed that he was an agnostic. And so, let alone being a philanderer, she was worried that he wouldn't get into heaven because he didn't believe in God. But the fact that she was so religious, I think, made her determined not to agree to any kind of divorce, because AP was telling Laura all through this 7-year affair, I don't love my wife, I'm going to divorce her and marry you. But there was no way that Clara was going to allow herself to get divorced, because it would not only be against her social interest, but it was against her religion. Her marriage was sacred. So they had some real knockdown, drag out fights.
Especially towards the end. And I would like your opinion on this. You look at this, you see somebody who is a philanderer, and you're like, this is just what they do. It's all about them. There's an aspect that you bring into this towards the end where you're like, hey, maybe he does love Laura. Maybe she does love him back. It's not this black and white, like he's just a terrible person and he doesn't care about anybody. You had some stuff in there that makes you kind of wonder, like, maybe he was really in love with her. What did you think when it was all said and done? Was there actually something there, or was this just AP loved the drama, and if it wasn't Laura, it would be somebody else?
No, I think they really had genuine feelings for each other. If you read the letters, I mean, the letters are over the top in some ways, and he was really obsessed with her for a time. He claimed that he couldn't sleep. I think it wasn't him protesting too much. I think he really did have strong feelings for her, but he also, I think he was less enamored of his wife, but she was his wife. She had borne him 14 children. Only 8 of them survived into adulthood, but he felt, I think, legitimately conflicted. His love of his life was not his wife, but he felt responsibility toward his wife and family. He would not leave them until he had paid off their debts and can assure that they would live comfortably. So that was sort of what kept him from ever divorcing Clara and marrying Laura. He said, I'm not going to divorce Clara until I can leave her comfortably. So, he was not a great guy. That's the baseline. But I think that he was legitimately split in his affections, and he just didn't know what to do.
And it got him shot. So,
yes.
Again, no spoiler, everybody. That's the first 5 pages. They're perfectly fine there. I don't want to get to what happens at the end of the trial, but I do want to bring up Laura goes for old reliable, or not that reliable, but a lot of people use it, the insanity plea. Now, when she does, this is kind of unsettled at this point, right? This is not something that has been used in U.S. courts a lot. Is this just a Hail Mary for her, the insanity plea? Do you think maybe she kind of dissociated? What do you think?
It was a relatively new thing. The first successful use of the temporary insanity plea was in 1859. This guy called Dan Sickles, who was a U.S. congressman from New York. He shot his wife's lover, who happened to be Francis Scott Key's son. And he got off on a temporary insanity plea based on something called the unwritten law, which was that certain crimes of passion are excusable, especially a man defending his wife who had been debauched or something like that. And so juries were very sympathetic to this. It's such an outrage to this man's honor that the fact he lost control of himself and killed the libertine who ruined his marriage. And there were a couple of other high-profile cases in which, very similarly, the unwritten law was invoked. And so Laura's lawyers sort of had an idea, well, we can sort of twist this and use it in Laura's case. But of course, there are differences. I mean, for one thing, she's a woman and not the man. And for another, she didn't kill her rivals, she killed her lover. So the analogies are not so great. But they based it on the fact that she, in her letters, there's a lot of evidence of this. In her letters and her testimony, she believed that God had married her and A.P. Crittenden in heaven before they were born. So in a sense, she thought that she was married to A.P. Crittenden in the eyes of God and that Clara was the adulteress. As a matter of fact, she accused Clara of being an adulteress, and Clara was like, what? What are you talking about? So they said that, this was a time when it looked to her like he and Clara were going to reconcile after a time apart. And so she saw the destruction of her marriage in heaven and lost it all and shot him. But they knew that was not going to be enough. So they also had another precedent for temporary insanity, which was a case where this woman named Mary Harris, she thought that her fiancé was going to marry her, but he ended up marrying somebody else and she kills them. And the excuse was dysmenorrhea, which is basically irregular menstruation. So they reduced it in the way that Victorian doctors often did to some gynecological issue that made her lose her mind. And this case was also invoked because Laura also had that kind of problem. So they thought that, well, maybe these two together would combine to a successful temporary insanity plea. And I guess I shouldn't reveal whether it succeeded or not.
Yeah, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole because just, oh boy, like that doesn't hold up well long term. But
I know. It's like the story just gets weirder and weirder as it goes on.
And the final aspect of this, too, is you're telling this story, but this book is also Mark Twain's around, and San Francisco's growing, but it gets full circle because in the background of the trial is San Francisco wants to be taken seriously. It wants to be looked at as the metropolis. It wants to be everything on the East Coast. So besides the fact that there's just a trial going on, it's also a trial of San Francisco at that point, right? Is rule of law going to win out?
They really wanted to send a message. They wanted to make an example of laissez-faire. They wanted to send a message to the world that, those old days of the Wild West in San Francisco, they are long gone. We punish people who don't follow the law here. So you should feel comfortable investing your money here. That's the audience they were kind of playing for, the New York and Boston financiers whose investments they really needed to grow the city. And the city had just come into closer contact with the East because the Transcontinental Railroad had just come the year before in 1869. And the murder happened in 1870. So they really wanted to promote San Francisco as a safe, orderly, stable town. And so they thought that the perfect instrument for this is this trial where we can really send that message.
Now, Gary, it's a crazy story. And as I've already said, a huge fan of you. I would like to know, who are your favorite nonfiction authors? Or are there any books coming out that you're like, hey, you want everybody to know right now, you need to grab this book or read this author?
Well, I really think that we're living kind of in a golden age of narrative nonfiction. I mean, people like Hampton Sides, David Gran, Eric Larson, all of these people are just producing great books. There's a San Francisco author named Rebecca Solnit, who has written a wonderful book about Edward Muybridge called River of Shadows. Who else? Isabel Wilkerson, her book on the Great Migration, The Warmth of Other Suns. All of these are books that I have just been so taken with and really have meant a lot to me. I do have a couple of friends whose books are coming out and will probably be out.
Tell us, give it to us.
Okay, there's a guy named Matthew Goodman who's written a book called Paris Undercover, which is a World War II story unlike any that you're likely to read. And an old college friend of mine, Josh Hammer, has a book coming out called The Mesopotamian Riddle about the race to decipher cuneiform in the 19th century. I really think that we are in a golden age of narrative nonfiction, and I hope people appreciate that and take advantage of it. I think there are books out there that will teach you something, but make it as painless as possible because you're reading a wonderful story.
I will say for the listeners, if you want to read my review of Goodman's book, it's already up on Goodreads. Hammer's book,
really?
Hammer's book I have not heard of, but that's going on the list.
Oh, good.
So, yeah. Gary, I think you're saying this, we're in this golden age, but there are people, poor misguided souls, as I call them, because it's not their fault, right? They went to high school, history was boring, they learned the same thing about the American Revolution that they did for years. If I sat one of them in front of you and they said, Gary, nonfiction, history, it's not my thing, and they said, why should I read Trespassers at the Golden Gate? What would you say?
I would say that my focus really is on the people and the personal narratives, and I get to the history through that. So people can ignore the history if they want to and just read the story. But I think that would be a mistake. But, it's the old cliche that, you want to make history read like a novel. And that's my goal. And, novels are interesting. They don't necessarily teach you anything. I think narrative nonfiction, it can have the value of both genres. And you can really be turning pages and learning stuff at the same time.
Gary, I loved it. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Well, thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Gary, thank you so much. Trespassers at the Golden Gate. Trust me, people, one of the books of the year. Get it. Hit us up, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.